Greetings. In this video, you will hear the most interesting and scary 5 horror stories. If you like these stories, you can subscribe so you don't lose my channel. Enjoy watching. The House of Endless Whispers. The carriage creaked and groaned as it made its way up the winding path toward Blackthorn Manor. The driver, an aging man with a weathered face, kept his eyes fixed on the road, his hands trembling slightly on the reins. He had tried to warn Helena before they set off, that no one stayed long at Blackthorn, that the house had a history best left buried. But she had dismissed his superstitions. Helena Ravensire had no choice but to come. After the sudden death of her estranged uncle, Lord Alistair Blackthorn, she had inherited the estate. The solicitor's letter had been brief, urging her to settle the affairs quickly. The manor had been left abandoned for years, and the townsfolk had no interest in seeing it restored. As the carriage broke through the mist, the house came into view. A towering structure of black stone, its pointed turrets clawing at the stormy sky. Ivy choked the walls, and the windows were dark, empty sockets gazing over the land. A place untouched by time, or perhaps forsaken by it. The moment she stepped out of the carriage, Helena felt it, the weight of unseen eyes upon her. The wind moaned through the trees, and the house itself seemed to exhale, as if it had been holding its breath for years. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. Chandeliers hung heavy with cobwebs. Portraits of long-dead ancestors watched from the walls, their expressions unreadable in the flickering candlelight. The scent of old wood and something deeper, something damp and rotten, clung to the air. The house was not empty. At night, the whispers began, soft at first, like the rustling of silk across the floor. Then, clearer, more distinct, voices speaking just beneath the threshold of comprehension. Helena would wake in the darkness, her breath caught in her throat, the whispers pressing against the walls, beneath the floors, behind the locked doors of rooms long forgotten. She tried to ignore them. She explored the manor by daylight, finding doors that would not open, staircases that led to bricked-up passages, and a library filled with books that disintegrated at her touch. In one room, she found a grand mirror, its silver frame tarnished, the glass rippling like disturbed water. When she looked into it, for the briefest moment, she thought she saw someone standing behind her. Then, the footsteps began. Slow, deliberate. Heavy boots pacing the halls just outside her bedroom. She would fling open the door, but the corridors were always empty. The candle flames would shudder, the air thick with the scent of damp stone and something else, something like burning. One night, she heard a whisper so close, she could feel the breath on her ear. "Leave while you still can." Helena spun around, but there was nothing there. The candle beside her flickered violently before going out. The darkness was absolute. Determined to uncover the truth, she sought out the one place she had been avoiding, the locked room at the end of the west wing. The door was heavy with age, the handle cold beneath her fingers. As she turned it, the lock gave way with a groan, and the door swung open. The room beyond was not empty. The walls were blackened with soot, the air thick with the scent of burned flesh. In the center of the room stood a chair, its wood charred and splintered, iron restraints gleaming in the candlelight. The floor beneath it was stained dark, and the walls bore deep scratches, as if someone had tried to claw their way out. And then, from behind her, a voice, a whisper, deep and ragged. "He never left." Helena turned, her heart hammering. The shadows in the room shifted, and for the first time, she saw him. A figure stood in the doorway, a man, or what was left of one. His clothes were tattered, his skin burned and peeling, his eyes hollow pits of darkness. He did not move, yet she felt him drawing closer, the air growing colder with every passing second. The whispers rose to a deafening chorus, echoing through the walls, the ceiling, the very bones of the house. Helena stumbled backward, but the door slammed shut, trapping her inside. The shadows surged forward, swallowing the light, the whispers turning to screams. And then, silence. Days passed, then weeks. When the solicitor arrived to finalize the estate, he found the house unchanged, cold, empty, abandoned. The servants Helena had hired were gone, her belongings untouched. But when he stepped into the grand hall, he noticed something new. A portrait had been added to the wall, alongside the Blackthorn ancestors. A woman, her dark eyes wide with fear, her lips parted as if caught mid-scream. Helena Ravenshire had joined the house, and the whispers would never stop. The portrait of Eleanor Grey. The rain fell in sheets as Victor Harrow arrived at Ravenshade Manor, his carriage cutting through the mist like a blade through flesh. The house loomed before him, a monolith of stone and shadow, its windows dark, save for the faint glow of candlelight from the highest tower. He pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders, shivering, not from the cold, but from the weight of expectation pressing down on him. Victor had been summoned by Lord Ashford Grey, an eccentric nobleman and patron of the arts, to paint a portrait of his wife, Eleanor. The letter had been urgent, its ink smudged, as if written in a trembling hand. "Come at once," it had read. "She must be captured before it is too late." Inside, the manor was eerily silent. The halls stretched endlessly, their stone walls adorned with faded paintings of Grey's ancestors, their eyes following Victor as he was led through the corridors by a servant who spoke not a word. Lord Ashford awaited him in the grand parlor. A man of gaunt features and hollow eyes, he seemed a spectre himself, his hands trembling as he gestured toward the staircase. "She is waiting for you," he murmured. "She has been waiting for so long." Victor ascended to the upper chamber, his pulse quickening. When he stepped inside, he saw her. Eleanor Grey sat by the fire, her skin pale as marble, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders like spilled ink. She was impossibly beautiful, too beautiful, he thought, for someone so close to death. There was a sickness in her eyes, a weariness that belied her youth. "You've come," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "I feared you would be too late." Victor set up his easel, his fingers itching to capture her, to commit her ethereal beauty to canvas. As he worked, he found himself entranced by her gaze, the way her lips barely parted, as though she were on the verge of speaking a secret she dared not utter. Days passed, then weeks. With each stroke of his brush, Eleanor changed. Her beauty became sharper, more haunting, her eyes darker, filled with something Victor could not name. He could not stop painting. He worked tirelessly, feverishly, ignoring sleep, ignoring food. He did not leave the room, and Eleanor did not move from the chair. One night, as the storm raged outside, Victor stepped back to examine his work. The portrait was finished, but as he looked at it, a chill ran through him. It was no longer Eleanor who stared back at him from the canvas. The figure in the painting was twisted. Her skin, once luminous, was now tinged with gray, her smile too wide, too knowing. Her eyes, black as the abyss, bored into him, and he swore he saw her lips part, as if whispering his name. A gust of wind extinguished the candles. The room plunged into darkness, and then, a soft laugh. Victor turned sharply. Eleanor's chair was empty. His breath came in shallow gasps as he stepped forward, his hand trembling as he reached out to the canvas. The paint was still wet. A whisper slithered through the air. "Thank you, Victor. I am whole again." He spun around, but the room was empty. The fire had died. The storm outside had ceased. And then, he looked back at the portrait. Eleanor was smiling, but the expression was not hers. It was his. The next morning, Lord Ashford found the painter's body, slumped over his easel, his eyes wide with terror. The portrait remained untouched, but the woman in the painting no longer looked like Eleanor Grey. She looked like Victor. Lord Ashford had the portrait locked away, hidden deep within the manor. But sometimes, when the halls were silent and the wind howled through the empty corridors, the servants swore they could hear a voice echoing through the walls. A whisper, "Paint me again." The Widow of Blackvale Manor. The road to Blackvale Manor was long and winding, cutting through the mist-drenched moors like a scar. It had been years since anyone had dared to approach the estate, yet here was Edmund Caldwell, summoned by the widow who had not been seen in over a decade. He arrived at dusk, his horse uneasy as they passed through the wrought iron gates. The house loomed in the distance, a relic of darker times, its once proud facade now weathered by neglect. Ivy clung to its walls like grasping fingers, and the windows, tall and narrow, reflected nothing but the storm-burdened sky. The door opened before he could knock. "She is expecting you," the servant said. Edmund stepped inside, his boots echoing against the marble floor. The house was suffocatingly silent, the air thick with the scent of dust and something sweeter, something rotten. Candles burned low, casting trembling shadows that danced like specters along the walls. He was led to the drawing room, where she waited. Eleanor Blackvale. She sat in a high-backed chair, her mourning veil obscuring her face, her black silk gown pooling around her like liquid night. Though he could not see her eyes, he felt them upon him, unblinking, measuring. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice soft as the whisper of dying embers. "You came." "You requested me, madam," Edmund replied, his own voice uncertain. She gestured toward the chair across from her. "Sit. We have much to discuss." He hesitated before obeying. "I have been alone for a very long time," she murmured. "Too long." Edmund nodded, unsure how to respond. He had heard the rumors, how Lord Blackvale had died under mysterious circumstances, how the servants had fled in the night, how the house had stood empty but never truly abandoned. "You are here to settle the estate," she continued, "to write the final chapter of Blackvale Manor's history." A gust of wind howled through the chimney, and for the briefest moment, Edmund swore he heard laughter in the walls. "It would be my honor, Lady Blackvale," he said carefully. She tilted her head. "Do you believe in ghosts, Mr. Caldwell?" He swallowed. "I do not." A pause. Then, the slow, deliberate lift of her veil. Edmund's breath caught. Eleanor Blackvale was dead. Her skin, pale as wax, bore the deep shadows of decay. Her eyes, milky, vacant, held no light, no recognition. Her lips, thin and bloodless, curled into the faintest of smiles. "You should have," she whispered. The candles flickered violently. The room seemed to breathe, the walls pressing closer, the air thickening. Edmund shot to his feet, his chair scraping against the floor. "You," his voice failed him. "You cannot be." She rose from her chair, her movements slow, deliberate, inhuman. "I have been waiting," she murmured, "for so long." Edmund stumbled backward, the walls groaning around him. The house shuddered, the floorboards splitting beneath his feet. The laughter in the walls grew louder, overlapping, a cacophony of voices. And then a hand, cold, skeletal, emerged from the darkness and gripped his wrist. Edmund screamed. The house swallowed the sound. When the villagers finally dared to approach Blackvale Manor weeks later, they found the estate untouched. The great doors stood open, the halls silent. But in the drawing room, they found two chairs, facing each other, and seated within them, two figures. Lady Eleanor Blackvale, her veil drawn, and Edmund Caldwell, his face frozen in silent horror, his hands folded neatly in his lap. The house had claimed another, and somewhere, deep within the walls, the laughter never stopped. The bells of Ravenshollow. The town of Ravenshollow was a place of superstition, where the fog clung to the cobblestone streets like a living thing, and the great bell tower of St. Roderick's Chapel cast a long, skeletal shadow over the village. No one dared approach it after dark. The bells, they said, had not rung in years. Yet on certain nights, when the wind carried the whispers of the dead, they could still be heard, tolling mournfully through the mist. Isabel Whitmore did not believe in such tales. She was a woman of reason, sent by her uncle to take up residence in the old Whitmore estate, which had stood vacant since the death of her grandfather. The house overlooked the chapel, its gabled windows offering a perfect view of the bell tower. Her uncle had warned her not to listen if the bells should ring. "They are a summons," he had said, gripping her wrist too tightly. "No one who heeds them ever returns." She had dismissed it as nonsense. The first night in the house was cold. The wind howled against the windows, and the candles flickered in protest. Isabel wrapped herself in a shawl, gazing at the chapel beyond the misted glass. The bell tower loomed, a black silhouette against the storm-ridden sky. And then, a sound, a single bell tolling, deep and resonant, shaking the very bones of the house. Her breath caught in her throat. It was impossible. The bells had long been silenced. No one had dared touch them since the tragedy, since the disappearance of the last bell ringer. The tolling came again, louder this time. Then, another sound, the creak of old hinges. The great doors of St. Roderick's Chapel were opening. Isabel's pulse quickened as she leaned closer to the window. A figure emerged from the fog, shrouded in a tattered cloak, moving with slow, deliberate steps toward the bell tower. A third toll. The figure reached the chapel steps. A fourth. The figure turned its head, slowly, unnaturally, toward her window. And though the distance was great, Isabel saw its face. Or rather, the absence of it. A hollow, gaping void where eyes should have been. A mouth open in eternal silence. A figure that should not be. She stumbled back from the window, heart hammering. The bell tolled again, rattling the very foundations of the house. And then, silence. She dared not look again. The next morning, she asked the housekeeper if anyone had been to the chapel in the night. The woman paled. "No one has entered that place for 30 years, Miss Whitmore." Isabel tried to dismiss it. A dream, surely. A trick of the fog. But the following night, the bells rang again. And this time, something knocked upon her door. A single, deliberate knock. She did not answer. She dared not move. The knocking came again. And from the hall beyond her room, a voice, rasping, brittle as dead leaves. "Come to the tower." She covered her ears, whispering prayers she had long forgotten. The wind shrieked through the house, and the knocking grew louder, more insistent. And then, nothing. She did not sleep. At dawn, she found muddy footprints leading from her door down the grand staircase, trailing out toward the chapel. The bells did not ring that night, or the night after. But on the third night, Isabel woke to find herself standing at the foot of the bell tower, her bare feet cold upon the chapel stones. She did not remember leaving her bed. The great doors were open before her, and inside, the bells waited. A final toll rang out. The villagers of Raven's Hollow did not speak of what happened to Isabel Whitmore, but from that night on, the bells never rang again. And when travelers pass through the fog-laden streets of Raven's Hollow, they sometimes hear whispers carried on the wind, calling them to the tower. The reflection in Blackwater Lake. The road to Blackwater Manor was long and silent, cutting through dense forests that seemed untouched by time. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, the towering trees blocking out the pale light of the moon. As the carriage rattled along the uneven path, Evelyn Hargrove watched the landscape shift, the trees thinning to reveal the vast expanse of Blackwater Lake, its surface smooth as glass, reflecting the night sky like a great, unblinking eye. She had inherited the estate after the passing of her uncle, Lord Edwin Blackwater, a reclusive man whose final years were spent in isolation. The solicitor's letter had been brief, urging her to take possession of the house swiftly. "You are the last of the line," it had read. "The house must not remain empty." But as the carriage approached the manor, Evelyn could not shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The house stood at the water's edge, its dark silhouette broken only by the flickering glow of candlelight from within. The architecture was severe. Towering gables, weathered stone, and ivy creeping up the walls like veins beneath aged skin. A single figure waited at the entrance. A woman, draped in mourning black, her face pale in the dim light. "You should not have come," the woman whispered as Evelyn stepped out of the carriage. "Excuse me?" The woman glanced over her shoulder toward the lake. "It watches." Before Evelyn could question her, the woman turned and vanished into the house. The first night in Blackwater Manor was uneasy. The house was vast, its corridors stretching endlessly, lined with portraits whose eyes followed her every move. The candles burned low, casting restless shadows against the walls. The lake beyond the windows was impossibly still. She dreamt of drowning. In her dream, she stood at the water's edge, her reflection rippling beneath the surface. But as she stared, the reflection did not move with her. It remained perfectly still, its eyes black and hollow. And then, a hand broke the surface. Evelyn woke with a gasp, the taste of lake water on her lips. The following days brought no peace. Servants spoke in hushed tones, refusing to go near the lake after sunset. The housekeeper, a woman who had served the Blackwaters for decades, would not meet Evelyn's gaze. And the reflection in the lake changed. During the day, she would watch from the drawing room window, her own face staring back at her from the water. But it was wrong. The eyes were darker, the expression too knowing. And once, just before she turned away, she saw it smile. Then, the footsteps began. Soft at first, just beyond the threshold of hearing. Then louder, pacing the hall outside her bedroom at night. One evening, as the rain lashed against the windows, Evelyn lit a lantern and followed the sound. She moved through the corridors, her breath shallow, her pulse hammering. The footsteps led her downward, into the bowels of the house, into a part of the manor that had long been abandoned. A door stood at the end of the corridor, half-rotted, black with damp. The air was thick with the scent of stagnant water. She pushed it open. The room beyond was not empty. A great, rotting mirror stood against the far wall, its surface dark as the depths of Blackwater Lake. And in its reflection, something waited. It was her, but not her. The reflection smiled. "You are late," it whispered. Evelyn's blood ran cold. The figure in the mirror stepped forward, though she herself had not moved. It reached out a hand, fingers too long, too thin, pressing against the glass. The surface of the mirror rippled like water. And then, with a terrible lurch, the reflection grabbed her wrist. Evelyn screamed. She was pulled forward, the cold grip of the thing in the mirror dragging her into the darkness. Water filled her lungs. She thrashed, clawed at the air, but the surface of the mirror had already stilled. The housekeeper found her the next morning, asleep in her bed, her skin damp with lake water. But it was not Evelyn who woke. The thing that wore her face smiled, stretching unfamiliar lips. It rose from the bed, moving with slow, deliberate grace, as if testing the limits of its new body. It gazed into the mirror, and this time, there was no reflection at all. That evening, Blackwater Lake remained as still as ever. But now, beneath its glassy surface, something watched, waiting.